Assalamu Alaikum everyone and welcome. Today we'll talk about Islam and Star Wars. It's going to be similar to um, our Lord of the Rings analysis, but this time it's Star Wars. So let's begin. We'll talk about like an intro, like the introduction to Star Wars, which is actually the original trilogy. And basically, Star Wars, or the saga, begins with the original trilogy, where a young farm boy named Luke Skywalker becomes like the unlikely hero in a battle against the Galactic Empire. And this like empire is really like oppressive as well. And yeah, like guided by his Jedi master Obi-Wan Kenobi and joined also by Princess Leia and smuggler Han Solo and the Rebel Alliance against the Galactic Empire, Luke learns the ways of the Force. And the trilogy basically follows the Rebel army's struggle to destroy the Empire's deadly superweapon called the Death Stars, while Luke discovers that the evil enforcer of Darth Vader is actually his father. And in the end, Vader actually redeems himself by saving Luke and defeating Emperor Palpatine, who is in charge of like the Galactic Empire. And he brings balance back to the Force and restores hope to the galaxy. But we'll talk about this in depth in the coming slides. So I originally I added clips from the movie, but I don't want to get copyrighted, so I leave these as markers, so you can pause the video and watch these on YouTube or anywhere else where you can find these clips. And yeah, I do recommend watching these. It will give you context of what I'm talking about. So the first clip, it's about basically it's an introduction to Luke, the main character, and his yearning for another life. I mean, he's yearning for like he wants to live another life, I guess. And you see him in this clip, looking out at the binary sunset. Binary is like because the planet has two stars, and yeah, like his emotional expression is it's really strong in this scene, and you can just tell that he's yearning for something. But yeah, do go watch it and then come back. But yeah, basically the original Luke Skywalker's begins with him as an impatient and restless young man living in a desert planet called Tatooine. And like I said before, he yearns for adventure and like a life beyond the slow grind of moisture farming. And farming is basically the occupation which his aunt and uncle do. And we see that in the beginning of the movie, he's kind of stuck with the same type of job of his aunt and uncle, but he really doesn't enjoy it. And yeah, although time moves like the same for everyone in the same pace, Luke's connection to the Force, which is still dormant, and he doesn't realize that he has this special ability yet. Even though he isn't aware of it, he has a heightened awareness, and making making his routine existent feel very drawn out and slow. And for example, in the movie, it says that a single season of farming feels like an entire year for him. And basically, his mind races ahead of his reality, and he senses and he wants to be something more, and but he doesn't understand what that something is yet. And the yearning isn't just for excitement, but it's like a deeper search for meaning and identity and purpose. These things which he feels that he doesn't really have living in Tatooine. And although it's common for some like a young adult to think about these things, it's kind of amplified in him by tenfold, just because he has that special ability like the Force, which slows everything down for him. He basically just feels stuck. So Luke Skywalker's longing for adventure and purpose is basically suddenly and violently redefined when he returns home after having a chat with Obi-Wan, and he finds his uncle and aunt murdered basically in front of his eyes, and his entire farm is burnt to ashes, and it's basically carried out by attack by the Imperial forces, like an attack carried out by the Imperial forces, and indirectly it's actually under the command of Darth Vader, who later on we know to be his own father. And what began as like a youthful yearning for something more is actually twisted into loss and exile, and the life he once found like dull is basically gone forever. And this moment actually flips his desires on its head, and Luke isn't really chasing after his destiny anymore for excitement's sake, but his like thrust into it. And he even says like there's nothing to hold him back anymore, so he might as well go with Obi-Wan. And the familiar like slowness of time on the farm, it kind of changes into urgency and danger, and also grief for his uncle and aunt. And it forces Luke to confront and face the fact that the galaxy is far more cruel and far more oppressive and complex than he imagined. So in the first film, it's called A New Hope. Luke Skywalker's growth isn't just physical or skill-based, but it's actually deeply spiritual. And over the course of the journey, he learns to quiet this impatience and actually tame his emotions and develop control and trust. But it is a journey to get there. We see in the movie that he's very, very impatient, and he's quick to action, especially in the beginning stages of the movie with Han Solo. And yeah, but he learns these lessons, and the lessons actually culminate in the final act when he's faced with an impossible task of destroying a Death Star. And a Death Star is basically kind of like a man-made type planet, not really a planet, but it's like a man-made station, and like with a click of a button you can basically destroy entire planets. And Luke is actually tasked with defeating one of these, and in the moment of truth, rather than rely on his technology or calculations, Luke turns off his targeting computer to target the Death Star, and he listens to Obi-Wan's voice, his mentor's voice, and lets go of the material tools, and entrusts instead in the unseen power of the Force completely. And it's basically this surrender and reliance on something far greater, which is the Force, that allows him to eventually succeed. So from an Islamic perspective, Luke's journey mirrors basically the concept of tawakkul, or trust and reliance on God. And tawakkul is basically the idea that after doing one's best with whatever means they have available to them, that person like ultimately lets go of all attachment and material outcomes, and places their entire trust in God. And just as even though like Luke trains and prepares and takes action, he only triumphs when he stops relying and clinging on to these technologies, or like cling on to other forms of control, and he puts his trust in the Force, an unseen and all-encompassing power that connects and sustains all things, basically God's will, or Qadr in Islam. So in this scene, Luke actually, you can pause it here, but Luke leaves Dagobah, or well, he trains with Yoda for a bit, and he sees a vision, which he sees his friends in danger and possibly dying, and he is very quick to want to help them out, but he leaves his training early. So yeah, you should go watch this scene and then come back. So Luke and the Force. In The Empire Strikes Back, which is movie 2, Luke Skywalker's journey is much more of a spiritual trial, as it is a heroic one. While he embodies many like noble traits of the classic hero, bravery and loyalty and self-sacrifice, for example, him rushing to help his friends after the vision, it also exposes immaturity and a misplaced faith in the Force as like a kind of safety net rather than a discipline. So Luke's decision to leave Dagobah prematurely, despite Yoda's stern warnings, is basically the clearest demonstration of his flawed understanding of the Force. He receives a vision of his friends Leia and Han in agony and possibly dying, but rather than interpreting this as like a lesson in detachment or a test, he takes it as a call of direct action. And Yoda and Obi-Wan both actually caution him and forbid him to go. They say, if you end your training now, if you choose the quick and easy path as Vader did, you will become an agent of evil. So in this scene, near the final scene of movie 2, Empire Strikes Back, it is revealed that after a very big defeat for Luke, he finds out that that Darth Vader is actually his father. And yeah, watch this scene and then come back. So Luke behaves as if the Forces basically will always shield him, as if like righteousness or nobleness alone guarantees victory. But we learn that even though he tries to save his friends Leia and Han, he fails to save Han and is really immensely overpowered by Vader, and actually suffers an emotional shock of finally learning the truth about his lineage. His hand is also severed, which is like a physical sign of his defeat. So his own, like, it's even more shocking for him because his own father technically actually cut his or severed his hand. And the positive view of his father, or like his imagined sense of his father, crumbles in front of him, and his entire view of like heroism basically shatters in front of him as Vader says he is his real dad. And this moment is basically really crucial because it actually humbles him, and it teaches Luke that caring isn't really the same as understanding the situation, and that rushing into action, no matter how noble the motive, can actually cause more harm than good. And it's only like this failure it's only after this failure that Luke begins to mature, and he slowly starts shedding his arrogance that once made him believe that he could actually bend his fate to his will just by being noble or heroic. So from an Islamic point of view, this reveals like an imbalance. The Prophet, peace be upon him, taught us that while we should rely on God, we also have to take necessary action and do whatever we can, and have whatever means available to us to do. So, for example, in this hadith, it says, "Tie your camel and then trust in Allah." And he said it. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said this to a man who questioned whether he should tie his camel or not, or whether the camel should be left unattended. And he basically thought that tawakkul, or trust in God, means to forego effort. But in this metaphor, tying the camel is doing the work and planning and preparing and training, and ensuring that you fulfilled all your responsibilities. And only after that actually comes surrender. So relating back to Star Wars, Luke actually does the opposite of this, and he relies on the Force without tying his camel, and he abandons his training completely before it's actually complete, and he dismisses his mentor's guidance, both Obi-Wan and Yoda's guidance, and essentially walks straight into a trap. And his motivations to save his friends is still rooted in compassion, but compassion without wisdom can be a dangerous guide. and he trusts the outcome without having earned it, and he expects that just because his heart's in the right place, that the Force will ensure his success. He still cares and still acts with clarity, but in the third movie, but when he learns to tie these lessons together, he does it without compulsion, and he learns to tie his camel and to train and to reflect. And he also, after doing these things, he places his trust in the will of the Force, and even though he isn't truly certain of victory. So in the Return of the Jedi, in the third movie, like I said before, Luke is caught between two powerful forces, his instinctive emotions, which we see in the first movie, where he learns to place his entire trust on the Force, and the second movie, his growing sense of conscious reasoning. These two lessons were both lessons that he learned in the two movies, both shaped by the hard, both shaped by the hard lessons of his previous journeys, and he faces the ultimate test in the third movie, not just in like outwardly, not just outwardly like in the battle, but in spirit also, when he's forced to face and confront Darth Vader. And Yoda actually also told him that his journey as a Jedi wouldn't be complete until he faces this challenge. And it's his own journey and his own reckoning to become a Jedi. So now he stands before his father and the Emperor, and Luke basically has to decide whether or not to strike down Vader or fall to the dark side and give up on his dreams of ever becoming a Jedi. And it's not really just a physical confrontation, but it's also like a moral and emotional one. Like we mentioned in our previous sessions in The Lord of the Rings, where the internal battle is within Frodo himself and the ring, and the outwardly battle is Aragorn and him fighting with the orcs. In Star Wars, it's actually Luke battling whether or not to kill his own father. And the final duel is basically this question, whether or not he can escape his father's destiny. So Star Wars is basically a vision of good and evil, but it's not black and white, and it's actually about choices one makes, and Luke goes back and forth with his emotions, whether or not to kill his father or not kill his father. So in this scene is one of my favorite scenes, Darth Vader versus Luke Skywalker. Just go watch it and come back and I'll explain. So Luke's hatred for his father's destiny actually leads him to destroy this destiny, and it's shown by severing his father's hand. But it's actually a cycle, because we see in the previous movie, in The Empire Strikes Back, that Darth Vader severs Luke's hand, and in the third movie Luke severs Darth Vader's hand, and we see that this is kind of like a cycle now, like a cycle of violence. And also, just a bit of lore, Siths actually have a tradition of killing their mentors. So Emperor Palpatine, who is in charge, or he's the mastermind of the entire galactic empire, he killed his own mentor, and Palpatine orchestrated or manipulated Luke, the mentee in this case, to kill his mentor, Darth Vader. And also Palpatine manipulated Darth Vader to kill his mentor, Mace Windu, too, and the entire Jedi Council, actually. But yeah, by this logic, killing Vader and becoming Vader are basically the same thing. And ironically, Master Yoda and Obi-Wan and Palpatine actually all order the same thing for Luke, and they order him to kill his own father. But Luke does something different. He rejects them all, and rejects his own destiny, or what they see is his destiny, and he embraces the good left in Vader. And also, ironically, this is actually when someone also finally calls him a Jedi. So before this, no one would call him a Jedi, not even himself. He always wanted to be a Jedi. But after making this decision alone, Palpatine is actually the one who finally labels him as a Jedi. And after, like, angered by the fact that he didn't kill Vader. But yeah, Luke places his entire trust, right, in this scene on Vader's good nature, and he takes a leap of faith as Luke faces imminent death and caused by Palpatine. And he thinks that if Luke could be, or well, Luke thinks that if he could be a Jedi like his father, which is the original Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, then his father eventually could be a Jedi like him. So the lessons that we learnt here is Luke acknowledges the complexities of his father's identity, not really just as Darth Vader, the Sith Lord, but also as Anakin Skywalker, the Jedi who he was once and still could be. And the choice to spare Vader actually reflects Luke's deep nobility, and it demonstrates true heroism is not really destroying one's enemy, but about seeking redemption and hope, even in the darkest of hearts. And his belief that he could be a Jedi like him, like his father, and then his father could be a Jedi like himself, actually underscores the transformative power of faith and forgiveness. And his refusal to give in to the darkness and his unwavering hope for his father's redemption actually breathes new life into the Jedi ideal, and it evolves it beyond the rigid dogma into something more human and more relatable. This is the rigid dogma of the Jedi. We will touch upon in the next section, in the prequel section of this video. But yeah, just like as a preview, the Jedi Council has a how do I say it? It has like a lifestyle of detachment, and it's not very empathetic. But here we see that Luke being very empathetic towards his own father, towards an enemy, Darth Vader. And he eventually, after this, that's why it's called Return of the Jedi, not just for Luke Skywalker but also for Darth Vader returning back to being a Jedi. But after this, Luke kind of upgrades and evolves the Jedi Council for it to be more empathetic to different walks of life and different people. So through his choices, Luke Skywalker actually teaches us that true nobility lies in forging one's own path and embracing strength and mercy and courage and compassion. In the background of all this, of Luke's inner journey, the rebels or the rebel army are engaged in like a seemingly impossible battle against an enemy which is far superior in power and resources, and they face the might of the Galactic Empire. They face Darth Vader also, who's like second in command, and even he can destroy planets like with a mere gesture with the help of the Death Star. And he does this with Leia's home planet, actually, in Alderaan. And while Vader's terrifying strength and presence are really clear and tangible, and we can see it in the movie, the true leader of the Empire actually hides in the shadows. And this is Emperor Palpatine. He even wears like a black cloak, and he covers his face too. And he manipulates the events that only few fully understand. And the unseen threat kind of adds a layer of uncertainty to the rebel struggle. They don't even know who they're up against, basically. And even if like Vader can destroy entire planets with ease, what are the chances of what Palpatine's power is like? What power does his power extend to, and it would go actually far beyond the brute force of Darth Vader, and he is kind of the pinnacle of a corrupting darkness in the heart of the Empire. Even then, even the overwhelming might of both Vader and Palpatine, the rebels still choose to resist, and they knowingly do this, and they knowingly surrender themselves, or they give themselves up to fight, meaning even though it would mean basically their death, but they give themselves to the cause, because they know that it's a fight for freedom, and it's not just really against just one tyrant, but it's kind of like a pervasive evil that threatens hope and freedom in every corner of the galaxy. And we see this as like we see an example of this character-wise in Han, where he actually begins as a self-serving smuggler and a bounty hunter who's only interested in staying alive and getting paid, and yeah, he just cares about money. But we see that he also like has no allegiance to the rebellion too in the beginning, and he has no political ideology, and he has no belief in the Force. And in A New Hope, in the first movie, he actually calls it a hokey religion, and instead he relies on his blaster and his ship and his wits to basically like live. But over time, as Han witnesses like the true nature of the Empire's brutality against selfless people and against innocent people, and he also sees the selflessness of people like Luke and Leia fighting against this brutal regime. The he basically gets enlightened, and like by the end of the film, Han actually says, "May the Force be with you," saying like suggesting that he now believes in the Force, and he returns also at a crucial moment to help Luke destroy a Death Star, and he starts out as just like a go with the flow sort of guy, only in it for the money, to an actual freedom fighter, willing to sacrifice his life for the rebel cause, or for like freedom. And also shout out to his friend Chewbacca. He's really loyal to Han, and not only that, he's also loyal to the cause too. But yeah, the original trilogy, I think, like above everything, it's actually, it kind of demonstrates the little guys fighting the Empire, or fighting like the big guys. And I think George Lucas actually mentions that he relates it back to like the Viet Cong, or like the war in Vietnam, and also like the Mujahideen against the British Empire and against the American Empire. And yeah, like you can see in the movie the where the Ewoks actually use guerrilla tactics. Like these guys in the background here, they have no technology whatsoever. They're very primitive in a sense, and they're the least people who you would think that would fight for the Empire. They basically have nothing. But we see that with the help of Leia and Han, they actually get creative, and they use the guerrilla tactics in the home planet to fight back and to destroy the Death Star. And yeah, despite their lack of advanced technology, they're still willing to risk and even sacrifice themselves for freedom, and freedom from their homes too. And their courage helps to turn the tide of the battle, and it proves that victory doesn't always belong to the most powerful, but to the most resolute, which we can actually see in today's time too. So we learn about we learn about a lot of lessons, but I think a key sort of overwhelming lesson or an overwhelming theme of Star Wars is actually compassion and different types of compassion. So here, the main compassion which is shown is actually compassion of the father or for the father, and Luke's compassion for his father is perhaps like the most powerful and defining part of his character arc. Once he discovers that Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker, his father, who was once a Jedi, Luke refuses to accept that he's completely lost to the dark side. And even when Obi-Wan and Yoda both, like his close mentors, both imply that Vader must be destroyed, Luke insists that there's still good in him and he wants to help. He wants to try at least. And the lesson of this is that true compassion sees beyond a person's action and believes their capacity to change. And Luke doesn't condone Vader's evil. He doesn't say, "Oh well, like you're completely good now. You've done nothing wrong." He admits he knows that he did evil, but he separates the man from the mask, and this kind of love is actually redemptive but not blind, and it's rooted in hope and not denial. His refusal to kill Vader, even under intense pressure from basically everyone, from the Emperor, from Obi-Wan and Yoda, it shows he's able to resist it, and it shows that compassion can be a form of resistance. The second type of compassion is compassion for the mentor and the relationship between mentor and mentee, especially with Yoda and Obi-Wan. So Luke's relationship with Yoda and Obi-Wan are built on respect, but it's actually also tested by disagreement. When they urge him to kill Vader, he challenges them not out of rebellion, but he does it because he learned to think for himself. He honors them deeply, and this is an example of this is him returning to Yoda after completing his training and seeking wisdom, despite past mistakes, despite the fact that Obi-Wan and Yoda both don't tell Luke about his father being Darth Vader originally, and he's very angry about this. He questions like, why didn't they say before? But he doesn't put it past them, and he still wants to learn from them even despite the secrecy of that. So the lesson that we learn is compassion towards mentors means respecting them but not worshipping them blindly. And Luke shows that love for one's teachers doesn't mean critical obedience, and he learns to balance like reverence with personal moral responsibility. The third type of compassion is friendships, and Luke's deep loyalty to Han and Leia actually drive a lot of his early decisions. In the second movie, he sees the vision of them in danger, and it prompts him to abandon his training prematurely. And although his choice ends in failure, it actually stems from an deep emotional connection he has with them and the friendship he has with them. By the return of the Jedi, he matures and learns that although he wants to protect them, he doesn't want to do it at the cost of wisdom or self-control. And the lesson we learn here is that compassion must be tempered with discernment. And early on, Luke's mistake of like he mistakes emotional urgency for moral necessity. So the urgency of going to Luke and for going to Han and Leia for help, he kind of mistakes that for being like a moral necessity, that he has to do it, that he has to help. But over time, he learns that rushing in doesn't always help those we care about and those who we love. True compassion it involves knowing when to act and when patience serves better. The fourth type of compassion is probably one of the most underrated, and it's really not often talked about. Even in Islam, it's not often talked about. And what I think is that like we share literally most of our DNA. The closest relation that we have DNA wise is to our sibling, because at the end of the day, we share both parents, we share both parents' DNA, and that is actually the closest relation that we have biologically. And but we never talk about our relationship with our siblings, or the closeness of the siblings, or the importance of siblings. And in Star Wars, it actually kind of covers this. And yeah, like when Luke discovers Leia is his sister, it kind of changes his perspective, and he begins to understand like the depth of their bond, not just as like comrades in the rebellion, but as like a family. In the final confrontation with Vader, the Emperor, or Darth Vader, and Palpatine use use the threat of Leia to push Luke into a rage, and it actually almost works, and he ultimately kind of he is very close to falling into the dark side because of that threat of his sister, and he cares for his sister a lot. That's why like he gets angered by if anything happens to her, then yeah, like he would fight them. And it kind of makes Luke realize how close he is to falling to the dark side. And the lesson that we learn from this is that like compassion also means like self-awareness and restraint. And Luke's love for Leia helps him to understand like what's truly at stake, not just like random lives, but souls and the people that he cares about. His near loss of control actually becomes the turning point where he reclaims his identity as a Jedi, and he chooses not to fight in hatred after this. This scene is one of my favorite scenes in the whole of Star Wars. This is where Luke actually reveals that Leia is his sister. But yeah, watch this scene and yeah, you'll see what I mean. So the next part is the prequel trilogy. So we learn about Luke and his relationship with Darth Vader, his father, but I didn't really talk about who Darth Vader actually is and where he began. And this is what the prequel trilogy talks about. And it explores the origins of this entire conflict of the Galactic Empire. And it focuses on the rise of Anakin Skywalker, who is actually a gifted young Jedi and is prophesied to bring balance to the Force. And this all happens amid growing political corruption in the Galactic Republic. So this was when the Empire was a republic. Jedi Masters Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi discover Anakin in Tatooine, and he is trained as a Jedi despite concerns with the Jedi Council about his emotional instability, which we will talk about later. As the Republic descends into war, Anakin becomes increasingly torn between duty and personal fear, and he is also manipulated because of this by Chancellor Palpatine, who eventually becomes Emperor Palpatine, and who is secretly a Sith Lord, Darth Sidious. Ultimately, what happens is that Anakin falls to the dark side and becomes Darth Vader, and also helps to destroy the Jedi Order. His descent paves the way for the rise of the Empire and sets a stage for the events of the original trilogy, which we talked about before. So Anakin, this is a case study of him. Anakin actually begins life as a really compassionate and gifted child, and he grows up in the harsh conditions of slavery in Tatooine. So he grows up a slave in this harsh desert planet of Tatooine, but despite that, he's still compassionate and he's still actually very clever and gifted. And yeah, despite being born into a world defined by greed and violence and human exploitation, he shows a remarkable capacity for kindness and empathy, and he helps strangers without hesitation, really. and offers his entire home to weary travelers like Qui-Gon and Padme, and maintains a sense of hope and innocence, which is really rare in under these circumstances of hardship. His creativity also flourishes in this environment, and he builds like pod races, which are kind of like flying cars, and even constructs C-3PO, who is like a android robot from scraps, and it actually demonstrates not only his intelligence but also his resourcefulness, and it's actually rooted in his optimism too. Qui-Gon recognizes this like young, unique spirit and sees Anakin as a and his potential for greatness. He identifies him as like the prophesied chosen one who will bring balance to the Force. So this is a scene, you can pause and come back, and this scene is basically where Anakin makes a decision whether to go with Qui-Gon to become a Jedi, which he always dreamed of, or to basically remain a slave with his mother, who is also a slave. And he shows his kind-heartedness here, because he would rather choose to be with his mother. He would rather be a slave than be a Jedi, but we'll talk about this. So yeah, when given the choice of being free to go with Qui-Gon and Padme, he chooses to remain with his mother even as a slave, and it talks about his compassion as well. But eventually he decides he does go with Qui-Gon because of the selfless act of his mother, even though she still remained a slave, but she persuaded him to go with Qui-Gon. So while Qui-Gon approached Anakin with patience and empathy, and almost like a fatherly understanding, which he didn't have a father figure before this, so it was really like special to him. The rest of the Jedi Council, particularly like Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Mace Windu, were very skeptical from the very beginning, and they sensed something really troubling with Anakin's immense potential, because of his like powerful emotions and deep attachments and like a restless spirit that he had. To them, these were dangerous signs and markers of someone vulnerable to the dark side. And while Qui-Gon believed that Anakin's emotional depth could be a strength if it was properly guided, the Jedi Council viewed it as a threat to their doctrine of detachment and emotional suppression. So what happened here is that in his teenagehood, he would have like visions of his mother, and he would miss his mother terribly, but Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Mace Windu would forbid him from ever visiting his mother, even though they know that his mother was in enslavement, and that kind of troubled Anakin from the beginning, because his mother was the only person who he knew since he was like born. But yeah, they kind of forbid him to see her. Even the close relationship between a mother and child is seen as a path to the dark side to them. That's how rigid the Jedi Council was. So yeah, like after Qui-Gon's death, Obi-Wan honored his master's dying wish and took Anakin as his Padawan, which is like his apprentice. But his own teaching style reflected this like orthodoxy or the rigidness of the council more than Qui-Gon's unorthodox approach. And Obi-Wan emphasized discipline, control, and emotional restraint way more like strictly, and reinforced that the idea of like love, fear, and personal attachments were paths to darkness. And Anakin really struggled under this weight, first with his mother, and then we'll see later with his love interest. But yeah, he tries to conform at first, but his nature was in conflict with Jedi expectations, and the love he had for Padme later became a line that he could not cross. But without he could not cross it without breaking their code, so he kind of broke the code in secret. So we see this scene, Anakin here, he sees a vision of his mother dying, and then what he kind of enacts revenge on his mother's killers. And this scene is kind of, we see that it's like an inkling towards Darth Vader. His anger is kind of emerging. But go see this scene and then, yeah, come back. So Anakin was like in his maybe early 20s or like maybe 19 when he reunites with his mother after being separated from her for years. And he finds her in slavery, tortured and dying in his arms. And the love of his mother turns basically from passion for the years lost, and it quickly changes into like a fit of rage, and he slaughters his mother's captors, not only his mother's captors but also their children and their woman too. And this is kind of like I said, the first inkling of stepping into the dark side. And Yoda kind of says almost prophetically, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. I sense much fear in you. And similarly, in the Quran, we can learn that the strong man is not the one who can overpower others. Rather, the strong man is the one who controls himself when he is angry. Anakin fails this test, and his fear of loss and is basically unprocessed and suppressed by the rigid Jedi code, and it left no space for emotional healing. And because of this, it kind of festers. It festers into a rage, and that rage, rather than being channeled into justice, becomes cruelty. And his inability to control his nafs, which we learn about in The Lord of the Rings. If you didn't watch it, go watch it. His inability to control his nafs, or the lower ego, is what ultimately begins to darken his soul. And in this moment, we see the painful truth of Yoda's warning and the Islamic insight that the heart is not really disciplined. Even love can become a doorway to destruction. This is the scene where it shows Yoda and Anakin having a chat. Anakin sees a vision and Yoda kind of gives him advice on it. It's kind of brutal advice. So watch this scene and then I'll talk about it now. Anakin's vision of Padme, which is now his wife. So he visions his wife dying in childbirth, and is perhaps like the clearest demonstration of his fear and mistrust. And it kind of collides, the vision kind of collides him further into darkness, because first with he sees a vision with his mother dying, and then he sees a vision of his wife dying. And because he couldn't do anything to save his mother, he doesn't want the same happening to his wife as well, and his unborn child. So it's kind of like a tragic repetition of trauma that he suffered with his mother, and he foresees like another loved one slipping away, and again he feels so powerless. But to his credit, Anakin turns to Master Yoda for guidance, and he seeks wisdom from someone that he thinks that he trusts. But instead of offering like empathy, instead of offering like kind words to Anakin, or helping him to confront the fear in like a healthy way, Yoda responds with kind of cold detachment. He tells Anakin not to mourn for Padme's death, but to rejoice in his own wife's death, for Padme will become one with the Force. While this reflects Jedi doctrine of non-attachment or detachment, it fails to speak to Anakin's emotional and spiritual turmoil, which basically goes unchecked for a decade. And rather than like easing his fear, Yoda's words intensify Anakin's alienation, and the Jedi once again ask him to deny what he feels. So from an Islamic perspective, this is a very crucial spiritual failure and spiritual teaching, a failure of spiritual teaching, not just for Anakin but also for the Jedi. And this is because Islam teaches that emotions like love and fear are natural and even necessary, but they must be handled with balance and guided by trust in God, not really controlled through suppression and not let out in outbursts either. When Anakin seeks help, he's not really met with compassion or wise counsel, but a philosophy that tells him that to sever ties to his emotions entirely, and it only deepens his internal crisis. And this kind of pushes Anakin into the control of Palpatine, because he is overwhelmed with the fact that he's going to lose the only person that he cares about right now, as of now, which is his wife. And without having the spiritual or emotional framework to process his pain, he grasps at anything for control. And Emperor Palpatine, or Chancellor Palpatine at this time, he preys on this vulnerability and manipulates him, offering false hope and a forbidden power to save Padme, basically, to have power of life and death itself. So in order to save Padme, he chooses a path rooted not in submission to divine will, but his own desire to master his fate and the fate of his wife. So in the Quran it says that indeed humankind was created impatient, distressed when touched with evil, and withholding when touched with good, which is kind of what Anakin feels like. The man who once showed mercy and compassion actually becomes a tool of violence and control, first when he executes Count Dooku, which is like a kind of a bad guy, but yeah, at Palpatine's command, he kills like a defenseless opponent in cold blood, which is Count Dooku at this time. Then, in like a desperate attempt to save Padme and gain power, he betrays the Jedi Order in totality by aiding the death of Mace Windu, and also the death of all the Jedi Council, like one by one. And he even reaches to the point where he kills younglings, which are children. Basically, he kills children who are training to be Jedi, only for him to want to save, only for the want to save Padme, and to want to build his own empire. And yeah, like Padme becomes shocked at this, and also Obi-Wan, and because of his paranoia and rage, he's blinded by jealousy and betrayal eventually, and he lashes out even at Padme, and he chokes Padme in a violent outburst when Padme tries to dissuade him from turning to the dark side. And so what we learn is like in trying to save her, he actually almost kills her. This is the scene, amazing scene, after an amazing battle. Just watch it. You see the emotional turmoil of both Anakin and also Obi-Wan. So once like Anakin gives himself to the rage, it clouds his judgment entirely, and he no longer sees right from wrong, or friend from enemy, and love from possession. His nafs, or like ego, dominates him in totality, and in his desire to prevent suffering, he becomes the very source of the suffering. So Anakin's fall is not really is not just a moral failure, but also a spiritual one, because he becomes enslaved not by just external chains like Palpatine, but also by his own unchecked emotions. And he becomes basically the very thing he swore to destroy. And he wants to, by wanting to deny his vision, he conjured the vision into reality. And the sadness of Anakin's descent was like one of the reasons why Padme died giving birth, because she was so overwhelmed by the change in Anakin that she was heartbroken and she died because of that. One reason anyway. But yeah, the guilt of this like was also one that haunted Anakin even when he was Darth Vader. But yeah, Obi-Wan, who'd been like a father figure and brother to him since a young age, represents the last thread of his former identity as Anakin Skywalker, and their fight is tragic, not just in like the intensity but also in its meaning. Anakin is no longer defending justice or love, but he's driven by pride and anger and a desire for control. And after like a brutal defeat and near death, his broken body is kind of encased in machinery by Palpatine, and he turns into Darth Vader. And Obi-Wan in the original trilogy, he says that he's become more machine than man. And this is when basically his transformation is complete. He becomes an enforcer of the very kind of tyranny and oppression that he once hated, that he once actually faced himself as a young child. And he kind of serves the Empire through fear. And on the inside, Vader is kind of haunted by shame over what he's become and also what he lost. And this is why even in the original trilogy at the beginning, he feels, although he knows about Luke and that's his son and he still likes his son, he sees that it's kind of like a dead end for him. There's no going back, so he continues to do evil things. And this, because this kind of mentality is like a spiritual lowest point, where a soul that has surrendered fully to the Nafs al-Ammara, the commanding self. And we saw this in Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, and is similar here, where it leads one persistently towards sin and self-destruction. But Islam also teaches that no soul is beyond the mercy of God. And the Quran says, "Say, O Prophet, that Allah says, O my servants who have exceeded the limits against their souls, do not lose hope in Allah's mercy, for Allah certainly forgives all sins. He is indeed the all-forgiving, most merciful." Anakin's journey echoes this truth. It isn't until he learns that he has a son, Luke, that the ice around his heart kind of begins to crack. And Luke represents hope and innocence and the possibility of change. Luke always wanted Darth Vader to change, and he always reminds Vader of who he once was and who he could still become or return to. And Luke's unwavering belief that he insists that there's still good in him, it kind of mirrors the principle of tawbah or repentance, and how it's always open no matter how far one has fallen. So yeah, through Luke, Anakin begins to see that redemption is not really earned by perfection, but like by the courage to turn back. So I wanted to dedicate this section also to like what we're seeing right now in the genocide in Gaza, and how Star Wars and how like the lessons in Star Wars and the Islamic lessons can teach us. So for example, Star Wars, particularly like the original trilogy and also like an offshoot kind of movie called Rogue One, tells the story of a rebellion against an oppressive imperial regime. And there's like several occurring themes which kind of resonate with the genocide in Gaza too. So for example, occupation and resistance. The Rebel Alliance fights the Galactic Empire, like we mentioned before, and they're really in like they're really like fighting a losing battle. It kind of seems like that anyway, because like the occupation uses military forces to control entire planets and populations. So what we're seeing right now in Gaza, that's only a region, but Imagine if the entire earth was put under tyranny. That was basically the case in Star Wars, and the Rebel Alliance, who were kind of hidden fighters, were fighting against that. It kind of seemed really like an impossible task, but they still are fighting back nonetheless. Similarly, like they use the Galactic Empire uses militarized oppression in the case of like the Death Star, which symbolizes the ultimate tool of state violence, and it's basically capable of destroying entire planets with the touch of a button, basically. And similarly, in like Israel, or so-called Israel, they seem to have immense militarized weapons. They use airstrikes, bombs, snipers against a defenseless population, and a starving population too. So yeah, that kind of mirrors it like that. And also like asymmetric warfare, where the rebels have very limited resources compared to the empire's vast military might, echoing real world like resistance movements. And yeah, the resistance movement for Palestine are limited, but they still manage to have they are still managing to hold on, like with the Rebel Alliance to. So the thematic parallels in Star Wars also, we see that it's kind of like a David and Goliath narrative. We mentioned that that it seems like an impossible task where we're fighting against people who basically control nearly the globe, I would say, in monetary wise and in influence wise. Like, even though like only one country has been aiding them since now, which is the US. But the US is a superpower, so somehow, even against the world, they are still managing to do what they want, even though the UN and nearly every single country has named this like illegal. But yeah, somehow they still have the power. And it's similar in Star Wars, where everyone hates the Galactic Empire, but that's basically Goliath. They can't really do much to fight back. And yeah, they use high-tech military against defenseless civilians. And Israel's use of advanced weaponry and surveillance also, like Mossad, echoes the empire's overwhelming technological superiority. And in Star Wars, we see the Ewoks having no training, no military at all, but yet they somehow fight and they use guerrilla tactics. And such is the case with many genocides and occupations too. Dehumanization and collective punishment. So the way like civilians in Gaza are treated, and Palestinians in general, and the way they are spoken about is kind of paralleled with how the empire sees its subjects too, as like backwards, I guess, and in need for ruling. And but like we see this where Leia's planet is destroyed for no reason. It's very defenseless, and they're very innocent too. They haven't really even fought against the Empire in any way, but yet Darth Vader blows it up just because he can. And it's that type of power and that type of entitlement which is kind of echoed. It was very similar to Israel. But yeah, free Palestine. But yeah, I think this is it for. This is kind of what I wanted to say about Star Wars. I think that doing these is really helpful for me to understand and to compare real world scenarios to like fantasy and how similar they are. I think even George Lucas, like I mentioned before, his inspiration for Star Wars was actually seeing these little guys versus the big guys. And he even brought up like the Mujahideen even. So yeah, like it kind of shows the inspiration, and it really demonstrates in the narrative, in the entire like double trilogy, I guess. The entire story, the entire saga of Star Wars has this type of meaning where you fight back against oppressive regimes. And yeah, I think it's really important for us to, in general, for us to, think about and place like an importance of, place an importance of comparing like fictional scenarios to real life, because I think fictional scenarios can do a better job of they can do a better job of how do I say it? They can do a better job of like demonstrating and showcasing the oppressive regimes that we have, but not in a like factual way, but in like an emotional way. We much more resonate, and we're much more empathetic towards characters rather than, for example, the news. It's sad to say, but it's kind of true, because in fiction we're kind of with them. We're seeing their journey. It's like we're with them personally, and that kind of, we cry at movies and books, but we don't seem to cry at news, or we're kind of desensitized to the news. Maybe that's why. But yeah, like doing these, and that's the reason why I do these, because they have more of a, we can draw more lessons from this, and it's more relatable, I guess. But yeah, let me know what other stories I should do next. Maybe I'll do Narnia, but yeah, that would probably take like part one and part two, because it's kind of like 7 books, but it has a lot of lessons, much like Lord of the Rings and much like Star Wars. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this long session about Star Wars and Islam, and I hope you learned something. Yeah, go rewatch the movies, the great movies, and also yeah, like try to see the parallels between our own world, our own like Islam, to these types of movies, because you can pick these things up, and as a result the movie will mean much more to you too. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Assalamu Alaikum. Thanks for watching.